Thank you. My name's Monica, like Daniel just said, and I'm a front-end developer at NetGuru. And today I will be taking you through the art of story thinking. For those of you familiar with the popular data visualization library D3, that's sort of where my journey with programming began. So this is a topic that's close to my heart and close to my mind. But because we had a lot of technical talks today, this is going to be much more high level. So we're not going to be necessarily working in D3 and creating a visualization, but viewing it from more of a theoretical or even philosophical perspective of how to approach creating visualizations, but also consuming them. But before we get started, I wanted to start with a quick story. So I was born and raised in the US, and in elementary school, every year we had standardized testing, so just testing to see if everyone was on par. And one of my favorite parts of those testings were, and probably my only favorite part, because I didn't generally like the tests, was something called a picture prompt. So they gave you a super strange picture like the one you see here, and the whole idea of it was that a picture is worth 1,000 words. So you could basically look at this picture and tell a story and take it in any direction you wanted it to go in. It just had to make logical sense. So it had to describe some sort of reality, but it didn't necessarily have to be our reality. It didn't have to match our reality. And so the reason I'm telling this story is that for better or for worse, data works the same way. So data visualization is just any visual representation of that data. So it's been represented in a visual manner, not as a translation of our reality, but more of as a transformation or a simplification. So it's meant to communicate a certain idea and make the data underlying it more palatable. So like I mentioned, it could be, we could take this data visualization as a story and take it in any direction. So this is actually a real chart showing real data. It doesn't have scales or anything at the moment, but I wanted to use it as an example to visualize a point. So this is showing the GDP growth rate for various countries from 1991 to the present. And there's one line that stands out that if I had a pointer would be more clear, but it's the green line. And so that year is 2009. And I wonder if anyone can tell me what the green line represents, what country? Yes. So 2009 was like the Great Recession, and I was in college then, and that was a fact that I loved to share with people, is that Poland's not suffering as much as other countries. Basically, even without scales, even without sort of these colors labeled, we still get an idea of what this might represent. But data visualization is also, in a sense, like trying to describe a mountain range with a map. So this is a map of the Tatra Mountains, for example, and we see that there's some things labeled. So we have the peaks, we have the different valleys labeled, but here you're missing sort of the fullness of the mountains. And I can tell you from personal experience that no visual representation, no map will ever come close to the actual conditions that you see in the mountains. So of the trails, of the weather surrounding it even, of the different elevations. So you're always only getting a sliver, a piece of the information that you need. Like this flower, for example, that I saw on the trail. So if we know from the beginning that a visual representation is never going to perfectly match reality, if it's imperfect, then why are stories and graphics so popular is the question I pose. And so the theory or the idea is that they can't be perfect, but they can be compelling. And what makes them compelling is what makes them popular. But what makes them compelling is not that they describe reality in its fullness, but that they zoom in so close to one element of that reality that our minds can sort of blur the background. So we sort of dive into this separate reality and just focus on particular elements. So a compelling story is essentially short and tight, and the logic that's presented within that story makes sense within its context. So that gives us the definition of the storyteller, I would say. I called it the use of the macro lens because the macro lens is really that part of the camera that zooms in to a particular point. So the producer of the story is really in charge of creating that sliver of reality, minimizing that reality by focusing on particular elements. And we're capable of directing the user's focus to those elements. But then if we have the storyteller and we have the story, then we also have the consumer of the story. And the consumer is really the person that dives into this realm of belief. So we often hear, at least in English, telling stories or thinking critically, but we never really hear the two combined. We never hear thinking stories or story thinking. And I think that's because we're meant to sort of believe it no matter what. We're meant to adopt the ideas of that reality. So because this presentation isn't necessarily about the storyteller or about the consumer, I wanted to take those two ideas and show you how they transform into the story thinker. So how does the storyteller, for example, become a story thinker? In the use of the macro lens here, the zooming in on particular elements transforms into the honorable use of the macro lens. So here it's no longer about knowing what to focus on to convince, but it's more of knowing what to focus on with the purpose of communication in general. So you're not trying to paint your reality, but you're trying to sort of communicate all of the possibilities and let the user, uncover that reality for themselves. And when it comes to the consumer of the story, belief, just pure belief, is transformed to constructive disbelief. So it's also not pure disbelief, but it's questioning every piece of what's provided in that reality and how it relates to everything outside the single narrative that's presented in the visualization. So it's about purposefully disbelieving so that we can engage even deeper to uncover the truth. And so the story thinker is both of those pieces in combination. When we're being a story thinker, we're simultaneously creating a story and questioning the story. So this is particularly important when you're approaching the design and development of a data visualization, but it's equally important when you're a consumer of different visualizations, not to just dive right in and believe everything that's handed to you, but to sort of think through how it was made, why it was made, and then question everything. It's an ongoing process. And that's what I would call story thinking in general as a theoretical concept. But how exactly is that applied? So if we understand how the different elements of a visualization can affect our focus, and if we understand how to question whether that focus or the direction of our focus is merited, or whether it had a certain intention behind it or not, then my theory is that we have the knowledge we need to understand and to produce representations of information. So the first part of that is really understanding the elements of the visualization and how they can affect our focus. So those are the first two sort of pillars, I would say, the components that affect our focus. And the second two pillars, which I'll go into, the meaning and the mapping, are more about questioning whether everything in that visualization makes sense, whether the materials and modifications are used in an appropriate and sort of unbiased manner. So to start with the first one, materials. Materials is basically what it says it is. It's everything we have to work with. So I could have called this elements or factors, but these are basically, when you look at a basic chart, a basic graph, you get shapes, circles, bars, lines, but it's also everything in between those shapes. So how we play with space is also in terms of materials. So the separation between the different elements, our graph paper, you could say. The size of the points, the size of labels even, having labels, these are all materials to work with. And of course, the rawest of the raw materials is data. It's ultimately what we're going to be modifying and visualizing. So the next piece is modification. And once we have those raw materials, we need to sort of inject them with some sort of meaning. Meaning is the next pillar, but first we need to modify them. So this is where the different transformations come in, like colors or animation between different frames. We have data transformation, so choosing the appropriate scales, whether we want a linear scale or logarithmic scale, will definitely make a difference in the final product and how that information is interpreted. We also have the range and the amount of data we choose to represent, and of course the type of chart that's used. So here a particular example is whether we use continuous or discrete charts. So those might sound like fancy words, but basically whether we want to represent something as a continuous line or a scatter plot, for example, where we just are interested in the trend, but the points aren't necessarily represented. And even that one element, the continuity between the different points, can affect how the information is interpreted. So the next pillar here is meaning, and if we have those modifications, this step is basically asking whether each modification of the materials has unique meaning. So this is sort of applying the dry principles, is basically, it's asking why this to each component of the chart. So if we have color, or if we have colored points, then are we just adding color to make it colorful, or does the color actually have particular meaning? Is it providing new information? And also in this, I guess, pillar is asking whether we have all the context we need to draw valid conclusions. And the final pillar is mapping, and this goes very close with meaning, but it's basically having to do with mapping to our reality. So is the meaning of each element consistent with the reality that it is trying to represent? So here come into play different heuristics, or even like human psychology. So for example, if you were trying to represent temperatures, are you going to color the colder temperatures blue and the warmer temperatures red, or vice versa? So basically, it's having to do with the heuristics that we already have adopted and whether it matches that reality. So now that we know the pillars, I wanted to take you through some practical examples of how we could approach story thinking as a consumer of data. So because we're not creating, we can at least apply a critical eye to some examples. So this is a chart of the world unprovoked shark attacks, and it actually comes from an article that claimed everything you need to know about shark attacks in like 5 charts. So I don't know if they achieved their goal, but we could definitely test them on that. So basically, I want to take you through some of my reactions to this chart and how they apply to the pillars. So the first pillar that we had was materials, and the rawest of the raw materials, the data, is where I generally start. So the first thing that's provided in the label is that it has to do with shark attacks from 1580 to present. So immediately I question the validity of the data from 1580 and whether it was the same quality as it is today. But that's beside the point. But it's just good to keep in mind. And of course, because this is a map of the world, I also wonder if the data capturing quality is the same for different parts of the world. So our eye immediately goes to America and Australia in this example. And again, those are 2 very developed countries, and the question is whether their reporting might just be better than other areas of the world. But if we assume that that's okay, we can move on to the next pillar, which was modification. So this is where the colors, for example, come into play. And here I have 2 sort of reactions. So the first is that they use a color intensity scale here. And I don't know if it's too small or not, but they basically color one shark attack as yellow and 0 shark attacks is gray. And so this is an example where they should have used a continuous scale and not a discrete scale, because there's a huge visual jump between the color gray and the color yellow. So everything that's colored yellow, we no longer know if that's 1 shark attack or 20 shark attacks, because they're using a linear scale and it's ending with 1,441. But that first jump from gray to yellow is really a huge difference, when in reality 0 versus 1 isn't that large of a jump. And another piece is the meaning, but it's also having to do with modifications. So we see that another element they used in this chart was the big circles, also representing the amount of shark attacks in a given region. So this is an element that is duplicative of the coloring of the map, so they didn't necessarily have to do the circles on top of the colors. It could have been one or the other. And the question is which one would have been better to keep, but in my opinion, the colors, because those circles get really crammed in, and especially the big circle over America just covers the whole country. But another piece I wanted to highlight here is what I mentioned earlier, is that your eye immediately goes to America and Alaska, of course, up there. And so when I first saw this, I was very confused that Alaska has that many shark attacks, but they chose to color this map based on country. And so I did a little bit of digging deeper, and turns out they have another chart that shows just America. And so this paints an entirely different picture, where just Florida is basically the source of all of the shark attacks in America. So again, that was a very misleading piece of information if you're just looking at the global picture. And to go further, this is another example that they had. So this is the total shark attacks by the type of activity that the victim was engaged in. And also a side note, the reason I chose this shark attack data is also a part of my American upbringing. So every week we have something called a Shark Week, on the Discovery Channel, and all that's played 24/7 is like documentaries about sharks. So it raises a lot of discussion, and it's definitely a part of like American culture. But it's more neutral than showing things about politics, so I chose to go with that. So here, if we look at the materials again, we can start with the dates. So from 1900 to 2009, and the title, Total Shark Attacks. So I don't know if you remembered, but the previous was confirmed unprovoked shark attacks. And this is just total shark attacks, so provoked and unprovoked. So there's a difference there that I guess as the critical interpreter of this visualization, we have to keep in mind before just believing the story that they're trying to paint here. And so your eye on this chart immediately goes to the red bars, which is surface recreationalists. And so one call out here is that while they're trying to say that surface recreationists have been, I guess, a higher percentage of the victims as time has gone on, the question you can ask is whether this is a matter of the sharks' preferences changing, or just a matter of the fact that people are engaging in more surface activities. So in that sense, there's no sort of point in even having this as a chart having anything to do with shark attacks. It could have just been called, I guess, like human activities relating to water. And then we would have seen a similar trend. And another piece is relating to that big red bar on bottom. So here they even had it go off the charts, and that's a very big no-no, because that's basically telling the reader that this is so huge that the chart can't even fit it, and you immediately think it's an outlier, that something is shouldn't have been that big, but it is. And so this is the final sort of example of consuming the visualization, and this is from a different category, just so you don't think that this only applies to shark attack graphics. But this was from an article in the New York Times about Ghana's increasing obesity epidemic, and they're showing the increasing fast food sales versus wealth of different developing and developed countries. So again, let's start with the materials here. The first thing that comes to mind is that only certain countries are represented here. We definitely don't have a dot for each country of the world, and the story or the picture could have been very different if, for example, all of the countries not represented fall in the decreasing wealth and decreasing fast food sales category, or in the top left quadrant, decreasing wealth and increasing fast food sales. So again, the story painted is very much dependent on the points that they chose to show. And then we can go to the modification pillar. So here, my eye goes to the labeled dots. And again, this is a question why they chose to label some of the dots and why they chose to not label others. You also see that the red dots have bold text, whereas the others don't. And again, this is sort of a unnecessary piece of information when we're looking at the meaning pillar. Does each modification provide us with new information? And here it doesn't, because only the red dots get bolded text. So our eye already differentiates them from the other dots. So there's definitely a lot more to a single graphic than immediately meets the eye. And now my question is, if I pose story thinking as a mode of thinking, can it be applied beyond just charts, beyond the charts that I showed you here? And if the answer was no, then this would be the end of the presentation, but the answer is yes. And of course it can be, because in essence, what is front-end development but the visualization of data? So we're basically provided with data, we're provided with content, and we need to visualize that in a user interface of some sort. So in general, if we treat all of front-end development as a visualization of data, then everything I just said could make sense. But if we want to go even further into that metaphor and see how story thinking applies to development, we can go back to our definition of the concept in general that I presented earlier. So with this definition in mind, what is the honorable use of the macro lens, the focusing in on a single piece of information or a single piece of functionality that contains its own reality, but functional programming or pure functions? And then if we look at the consumer and the constructive disbelief and basically testing and questioning everything that's presented in what the storyteller has produced, then that's really just the concept of testing. So in this sense, story thinking is really about minimizing side effects, minimizing, in terms of data visualization, it's about minimizing the attention that we're taking the user's eyes in, if it's for a specific purpose and not just the communication of the information. And here it's just sort of a principle of functional programming. It's minimizing side effects. So it might be a loose connection, but I wanted to at least challenge myself to try to apply story thinking to something more broad than charts, and I challenge you to do the same. And so basically we took a look at what defines the concept of story thinking in general, what it can be applied to, and how it looks in practice. But if there's one thing that I want to leave you with today, it's the notion that when it comes to data visualization, it's not necessarily about sharing the truth that we think we possess, but it's about empowering an audience to uncover the truth themselves. So it's about truthfully sharing. So believe in the truth's power to reveal itself. Is that the data is the truth in our case, and let the data speak for itself, just provide it in an unbiased manner. And so that's sort of the end of the slides, but I wanted to take you through a couple examples of how I applied these in recent visualizations. I see it on my screen. Yeah. Okay. So this isn't the prettiest version because this is from like 3 years ago, but I can't show the actual version that the client's using. But this was a chart that I created for the University of Pennsylvania, and they had a survey called the Factors of Influence Survey, which basically MBA students, business students would take, and it would provide them with a series of questions and then analyze them on 12 sort of factors of influence. So factors that affect their negotiations and their negotiation strategies and success in those negotiations. And then the same survey was provided to third-party raters, so people that they've worked with in the past or people in their family. And the idea of this visualization was to sort of compare their image of themselves with how other people see them. So we see that immediately certain aspects jump out, like this person thinks he's much stronger in might than his third-party raters would. And another piece of information here is actually in the animation. So the fact that we can see basically how these pictures are changing for each student. So each student had their own ID. and the user could click through and see them changing. And so how did I apply the pillars of story thinking here? Well, if we look at the colors, we definitely wanted them to match natural heuristics. So the red is sort of the hard power categories, the green is smart power, and the blue is soft power. So this is the logos, ethos, pathos, sort of Aristotle's modes of influence, his factors of influence. So that's what the coloring was about. And originally we had this as a normal bar chart, but again, a separate piece of information was achieved when we created a radial bar chart from this graphic, because not only are we then seeing the sort of the height of each of the bars, but we're seeing the picture in general and whether there's trends in a certain direction, whether it's soft and smart or hard and soft for some reason. And so that was providing us with a new and unique piece of information. And one thing that we applied lately that isn't in this chart is the scale. So this was another point of contention, is that currently the area of this sliver was not sort of proportional to the numbers. So we ended up changing this to more of like a radial scale, a quadratic scale based on the radius, so that basically the smaller numbers were further apart than the larger numbers, so that the area in the curve was proportional to what it should be. So that's one example. And then the last example is basically a personal project using data from the European Union. And this is an example of just providing users with a tool where they can uncover their own truth. So this is data showing where Europeans fly to. So we have the nations of the European Union. And the only real modification here is the intensity and thickness of these lines connecting different countries. And so if we look at Poland, for example, we see that most flights are to Germany and the UK, which would make sense. But again, we're not outright providing the user with this information by, say, coloring this line in green when everything else is red. We're just giving them the interaction to be able to uncover the insights themselves. And so that is story thinking in practice. And thank you.